This message comes from NPR sponsor Sony Pictures Classics with Daddy-O, a new film starring Dakota Johnson as a young woman who hails a cab and Sean Penn as a seasoned cabbie, taking a journey of discovery on a trip from JFK to NYC. Daddy-O is now playing only in theaters.
Hello, hello. I'm Brittany Luce, and you're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR, a show about what's going on in culture and why it doesn't happen by accident. The true credit for bringing the recipe to my attention comes from our producer, Corey Antonio. He had these biscuits at this brunch party that he said were the best biscuits that he had ever had in his life.
Oh.
Okay, Corey Antonio is from the South.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And that's high compliment. I got chills and everything off of that. The best biscuits. Okay.
That's Crystal Wilkinson, former poet laureate of Kentucky. And she created the most perfect biscuit recipe I've ever tried. And thanks to those flaky layers of dough and butter, I went on a journey through the foods of her upbringing and the Appalachian region of Kentucky. Crystal is the culinary mind behind Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghosts, stories and recipes from 5 generations of Black country cooks. It's a cookbook that weaves intimate stories with treasured family recipes to pay tribute to the women in Crystal's family who taught her how to live, love, and cook.
It came to me when my grandmother passed away. I knew how to cook, but that first holiday after she passed was one of the hardest. I'd get started, I'd break down, I'd start to make my dressing, and I would break down. And finally, I remembered one of her dresses. And I went and got the dress out of the closet and brought it in here in my kitchen and hung it up on the back door. And I felt as if she was in the room, like she was saying, okay, girl, come on. And it just cracked open this whole much larger thing for me.
Today on the show, Crystal talks about preserving Black Appalachian food culture and the ghosts in her kitchen. Crystal, welcome to It's Been a Minute.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. We're going to be talking in this conversation about memory. We're going to be talking about memory a lot. And so I have to ask, is there a specific memory that comes up for you when you smell fresh baked biscuits?
I think almost all of my food memories are tied to my grandmother. Like I remember that's the first thing you would smell in the mornings when you get up, even before you got up, like you were like, it woke you up like, what's that? What's going on? So I remember that as a child, like smelling breakfast, but smelling the biscuits in the oven. You knew it was time to get up and start rolling.
That's your alarm clock. The kind of cuisine and food that you describe in your book and that you grew up with is not exactly the kind of Black Southern cuisine I think many people imagine when they're thinking about Black Southern cuisine. But Black Appalachia has its own culture and foodways that are distinct from like the barbecue ribs and peach cobblers that people commonly associate with, down home Southern cooking. Can you describe Black Appalachian cuisine for those who are unfamiliar?
And what makes the difference is the terrain. Like geographically, it's different. And so part of the focus is on making sure that you have ways to store food all winter so you can eat. For example, when you harvest your potatoes, you'll dig a hole and you'll keep them in that hole, and so that you
almost like nature's root cellar or something like that.
So you can have potatoes all year long. But in my house, we put them in the attic. That was one of my tasks as a little girl, was to go up into the attic and get me a pound of potatoes. She would have me put them out on newspaper. You didn't want them to rot, so you couldn't have them to touch. And so that kind of like preservation, which during my time was habit, right? But when my grandparents were raising their children, like this was survival. Like you have
necessity.
You have to find ways to have food all winter because you won't be able to grow it. You won't have, green things until spring. So you had to can. Of course, later on, they could freeze things once you got a deep freeze. But during their time, it was like, what can we put in the smokehouse? What can we put in the cellar? What can we dry? So I think those are the biggest differences between Southern cuisine and Appalachian cuisine.
I mean, I even think about the focus that you put in the book on foraging. I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to say it's gone fully mainstream, but it's kind of trickled into, I feel like, a lot of mainstream food conversations over the past few years.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, a lot of those conversations online have been led by an amazing Black woman named Alexis Nicole, who runs like a James Beard award-winning foraging account on TikTok, which is incredible. But I think maybe before her prominence, a lot of people associated foraging with elite Scandinavian cuisine where you're
Mm-hmm.
going to sit down and get 12 bites for $600.
Right,
Do you know what I
right,
mean?
right.
Like going out into the Norwegian forests and plucking a few leaves is thought of as a delicacy. It's interesting to see how even you reclaim some of those foodways like smoking or like foraging that have become kind of, I think over time, desaturated of their color when people are talking
Ah,
about these traditions.
absolutely,
Is
absolutely.
interesting to see that reclamation happening.
I love that. And, I think about my grandmother a lot and how tickled she would be at being delicacies now. And of course, again, our people did it for survival. Picking
Mm.
blackberries in the summer was a huge event in my family. It was like one of the big events. And it was dangerous. I talk about that in the book too, about how dangerous it is. Like, not only
Hmm.
do wild blackberries have the brambles where you can risk getting pricked by the brambles when you're picking them, but like you had to watch for copperheads and rattlesnakes. So there were all these rules
Ooh.
in July in the peak of heat season. Like you've got to wear long pants and you got to wrap your ankles and wrap your wrists to keep the chiggers away. So there were so many rules, but it was a huge event. I mean, you would probably have a blackberry cobbler that night or
Mm.
the blackberry soup that I have in the book.
Hmm.
And then she would can them. And then that was one of the delicacies we had come Christmas, where there was always a jam cake for Christmas. So it's like this whole big thing that lasted all year from that summer blackberry picking.
Hmm. You share so many amazing memories about the communal aspect of food, from foraging to harvesting to cooking, but also how food was a centerpiece for celebrations and gathering. And it seems like it was a centerpiece also of your life at church. What did that look like?
Yeah, so every year we had something that was called basket meetings. Another name for it is dinner on the grounds. And so this was a huge event. There were so many. My grandmother would say courtings and marriages that came from the annual basket meeting. That's where you would meet your person. At the end of it all, like really, the church and the church service was like secondary or maybe further down the line than secondary because it was all about the food and all about putting your finest clothes on and strutting around.
Hmm.
And food was at the center. And people would come from miles around and out of state. It would be like, okay, if you're going to get this cake, make sure you get it from Aunt Teen, who was my grandmother. If you're going to get this, make sure you go to this woman. And they see a pie or a cake and say, who made that?
Oh, it's so true.
The women were respectful of one another, but they were always, eyeing each other's tables under their hats like, there's her peach cobbler. Like, look at mine. I think that's where I got this thing that not only should your food just provide for your family or the people that you're cooking, but you need to show off. Like, this is where you got to show out, like put your whole foot, as they would say, in it. Like, you can't just like throw something together. You got to mean it. You got to burn, as we say. You got to really put everything in it if you're going to put food in front of people.
You share so many intricacies and specific stories, from how food is grown and harvested to how it's prepared to how you enjoy it and who you should get it from. Why is it important to you to get specific with the lineage of Black Appalachian cuisine? Like, why do you feel compelled to define it?
Black people in Appalachia have been exiled for so long. It's been as if we did not exist. I've even heard other Black Appalachians kind of, when they hear that word, kind of get squirmy and like, I don't know. I grew up there, but I don't know if I would say that I'm that word.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it is ours too. Like, it is as much ours as it is anyone else's, and sometimes more. Like my family lived there for more than 200 years. So it's like, how can it not be mine? So I'm going to claim it. We need to be a part of this conversation and the specifics of how we lived and how we are living our lives.
It seems like part of accomplishing that is collecting and sharing some of your family's recipes. Like many of us, you don't always have access to that recipe easily. There are moments where you might hit some bumps in the road or sometimes a dead end or a red herring in trying to nail down a family recipe. Please tell us, how did you go about researching, testing, and writing the recipes you feature in your cookbook?
Well, I had a head start and have had a head start for a long time.
Hmm.
One of my fondest memories is being 12 or 13 years old, and I'm in home ec class. And our first assignment is to get a little metal recipe box, and we're supposed to fill it up, A to Z with all these categories, cookies, cakes. And so instead of me sort of asking my grandmother, well, how do you make this? I would say something like, oh, well, tell me about biscuits. And she would say, well, first you're going to get this. And you're going to reach down there and get me that white bowl, or reach over there and get me this. And there were no measurements for most of it, but I chronicled. I wrote it down on my little recipe cards, and I sort of translated what she was saying the best I could. She did have some recipes written down. So I had that box in high school. And so I still have that box. Every holiday I've cooked from that little rusty recipe box. So I had a head start on some of those. And the others I had to just use ancestral memory. The way that my grandmother entered the kitchen that first Thanksgiving after she passed, I had to say, okay, all right, Granny. And the biscuits was one of them. My grandmother never really used butter in her biscuits. It's an amalgam of what I remember, what I have written down, and sort of relying on intuitive cooking to get me there, and taste. Like that biscuit recipe was well tested. And I realized that so many of these recipes, I had to just get as close as I could to recreating the ones that I didn't have.
I also really loved a story that you shared about calling your cousin Deborah to get the gingerbread sauce for a particular cake. Please tell us about that.
So cake and sauce is really popular throughout Appalachia. So I knew how to make the gingerbread, but I did not know how to make the sauce. And so I called Deborah, and she said, let me call Mama. So she got the recipe from Aunt Lo, or what Aunt Lo remembered, and then she started telling it to me, and I was like, no. She gave me the ingredients. I said, don't tell me. I want to be able to experience it myself. And so I did, and it was just the intuitive cooking. Like it all came back to me as I was putting it together. And I was like, there it is. I tell people all the time, like when I was on book tour, it was so emotional with people coming up and saying, I still can't make that corn pudding good as my mama. And I said, and you never will be. You won't be able to. You can't.
I want to talk about that. I want to start by acknowledging, of course, that it can be intimidating to try your hand at the family classics. Maybe you don't have the recipe. My mom, she keeps it all up here. And if she tells it to you, what she's saying does not match what you see her doing.
Right.
So you got to watch her to take notes. So we don't all have access to the recipes. But then there's, the matter of being judged for not nailing the macaroni and cheese, or even, feeling like your sweet potato pie is not going to be as good as your mom's. But you and your book posit that that's a normal part of the cooking process. How did you come around to that understanding?
So here I am at this age and gone through this and I'm like, dang, I still can't get it right. Like I still can't.
No way.
I still can't quite get it right. One, it's memory. The memory always tops it. Even my grandmother, that was where I started, because I remember my grandmother saying, oh, this cake is so good. And she'd go, not as good as my mama's. It's not as good as my mama's. And so here we are. Every generation says that, I said that about my grandmother's food. And now here are my children saying, Mama, I followed it. I follow the recipe, but it's not quite like yours. And so, one, the memory doesn't top. Two, the ingredients are different from those previous years than what we have access to now. And so I think it's a combination. Like you have to get as close as you can. And that's all you can do. And accept that. Like, you can't spend 40 years trying to make your mama's cornbread. Like you get as close as you can and you live with that. And then some generation, even if you don't have children, there'll be somebody, a niece, a nephew, a friend will come after you and will say, this is not as good as Brittany's. But, I almost got it, but it's not quite as good as Brittany's.
And I can only hope my niece will say that one day about something not as good as BB's. We can only hope.
And that's what it is. I don't go for perfection. I think it's a way of building an altar, really. Making cornbread, making a skillet, a pone of cornbread in the ways of your most recent ancestors and your long gone ancestors is a way of pouring libations and honoring those kitchen ghosts. So that is how I see it.
I really think with that kind of cooking philosophy, you are free some people. Oh my gosh, Crystal, it has been such a joy to talk with you today. And I have a feeling that a lot of our listeners are going to be communing with their own kitchen ghosts very, very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Crystal Wilkinson, author of Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghosts, stories and recipes from 5 generations of Black country cooks.
This message comes from NPR sponsor LinkedIn Sales Solutions. Are you struggling to close deals? B2B selling is tougher than ever. That's why they're introducing LinkedIn Sales Navigator. It's a sales intelligence platform that helps professionals effectively prospect and engage high-value customers, drive higher revenue, and increase sales performance. Right now, you can try LinkedIn Sales Navigator and get a 60-day free trial at linkedin.com/spinaminute. Let LinkedIn Sales Navigator help you sell like a superstar today. This message comes from NPR sponsor Discover. It's good to share helpful knowledge, so here's a tip that could be doubly helpful. Discover will automatically double all the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. Get rewarded no matter who you are or how much you spend with Discover. It pays to discover. You could even say it double pays to discover. They won't stop you. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. This message comes from NPR sponsor Homes.com. When you're home shopping as a parent, you have lots of questions about local schools. That's why each listing on Homes.com includes extensive reports on local schools, including photos, parent reviews, student-teacher ratio, school rankings, and more. The information is from multiple trusted sources and curated by a dedicated in-house research team. It's also you can make the right decision for your family. Homes.com. We've done your homework.
So last week, I asked you what dish your family member makes better than anyone else in the world. And we got a really good response.
Hey, Brittany.
Hey, Brittany.
Hey, Brittany.
My partner John grew up in New Jersey and likes to consider himself an honorary Italian. I usually make fun of him for this, except when I'm enjoying his baked ziti. The noodles, ricotta, sweet sausage, and red sauce he makes himself seep and crust together perfectly in the oven for a combination of flavors and textures that is irresistible, even when you insist you're on a diet.
Oh my gosh, Miriam. It is like 90 degrees outside and you have me ready to turn on my oven. I just want you to know that description sounds unbelievable. Not only did you beautifully lay out how this dish is constructed and all of the ingredients that are involved, but I could hear the love in your voice and the appreciation when you talked about all the details that make your partner's baked ziti so special and so delicious. Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, if he doesn't mind, please have him send over a recipe, please. Now for me, the dish that my family member makes better than anyone else in the world, it's gotta be my mom's sweet potato pie. My mom's sweet potato pie is like the platonic ideal of what sweet potato pie is and should be. It has a brightness to it. It is perfectly sweet and balanced. The texture is custardy without being heavy. It really showcases the vegetable and doesn't cover everything in unnecessary amounts of spice. She uses fresh sweet potatoes, not that stuff in the can that makes the pie brown. And my mom's sweet potato pie beat out Patti LaBelle's in a blind family taste test. So I just want to say, it is official that my mother's sweet potato pie is better than anybody else's in the world. It's also better than anybody else's in the world because nobody in my family knows how to recreate it. You can watch her make it. You can write down everything she says, but you got to watch what she's doing. Me and my sisters, we're trying our best. We have tried over the past maybe 10 to 15 years to attempt to try to get our sweet potato pie to be somewhere in the neighborhood of hers. It hasn't happened yet, but one day I think, though, I'll get close. So, Mom, thank you so much for making the perfect sweet potato pie that has ruined all other sweet potato pies for me. Miriam, thank you so much for calling in. So that's my Hey Brittany for this week. But if you want to be heard on next week's Hey Brittany, oh my gosh, do I have a question for you. Next week, we have an incredible conversation with the legendary singer Mavis Staples on the show. And in speaking with her, she attributed a lot of her success to her mentor, Mahalia Jackson. So I want to know, what's the best advice you've ever gotten from a mentor? Send us a voice memo at ibam@npr.org. That's IBAM@npr.org. This episode of It's Been a Minute was produced by
Corey Antonio Rose,
Alexis Williams.
This episode was edited by
Jessica Plachek.
Engineering support came from
Quasi Lee.
Tiffany Vera Castro.
Our executive producer is
Verilyn Williams.
Our VP of programming is
Yolanda Sanguini.
All right, that's all for this episode of It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Brittany Luce. Talk soon.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Capella University. Capella's programs teach skills relevant to your career, so you can apply what you learn right away. See how Capella can make a difference in your life at capella.edu. This message comes from NPR sponsor Shopify, the global commerce platform that helps you sell and show up exactly the way you want to. Customize your online store to your style. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/NPR.